first of all, I just want to thank the event organizers, Andy, for your presentation, and Pete, you've been at this work for far longer than I've been here, so appreciate all you've done for Camden students through your partnership efforts here. And thank you all for being here. I wrote down some remarks, so they're going to come off a little bit formally because I'm just going to read what I wrote down. So apologies in advance for the formality here. So when I was asked to participate in this conference, I took one look at the title, From Worst to First, and to be totally honest with you guys, I had some reservations. I wouldn't dare label our resilient children, incredible parents and grandparents, and dedicated teachers as the worst. Nor would I argue that we're on our way to being first, because for starters, competition implies winners and losers, and we want all of our kids in our state and country to succeed. But also because it is entirely premature to draw any long-term conclusions about education policies in Camden over the past 2 years. We're not trying to beat out this district or that. We just want the best school system for our children here in Camden, and we are not there yet. So why did I agree to speak here today? Well, first I want to give my perspective on the Camden I've gotten to know and the people I've come to appreciate and love over my short tenure here so far. There are so many individuals who have been working here long before I ever set foot in this city. Educators like Katrina McCombs and Emily Vossler, community leaders like Anthony Ways and Sean Brown, parents like Alicia Rivera, Rosa Trent, and Monique Ragsdale, and countless, countless others, who will deserve the lion's share of the credit that is ultimately handed out for the improvements I believe we can ultimately achieve. Second, I want to explain some of the progress we have seen, because while we should be completely real and honest about the fact that we have a long way to go to fulfill our promises to our students and families, we have seen our kids do some really amazing things over these past 2 years. And third, I want this crowd to hear directly from me what it is that we are doing now and in the future, and we'll take some questions afterwards, and why I think the approaches we are taking will help our kids and make our city even greater. Before I jump in, I also want to be absolutely crystal clear, as we are at a conference that asks premature questions like, can Camden be a national model? The problems we face are entrenched. They are several decades old, they are systemic and complex, and they have at their roots the tremendous challenges brought forth by years of poverty and institutional racism. There shall be no silver bullets to solve these challenges, no structural reform or easy solution to the problems that began before most of us here were born and continue to this day. There can only be the really hard work and really open dialogue and communication, and that's why we are all here. And I also want to stress, the language we use is really important. We absolutely have to have an honest conversation about Camden education, but we must do so in a manner that sees our local community members, teachers, and students as assets, not liabilities. This city that I have been fortunate enough to call home for the past 2 years has been incessantly pathologized and constantly under a policy microscope. We have to ensure we are not perpetuating that mindset. Nobody wants to be spoken of as if they are the subject of a white paper, least of all the tens of thousands of members of this Camden community, and I ask that we keep that in mind as we talk about Camden over the course of today. So with that framing, I'd like to move forward by speaking about 3 things today. The scale of the challenge we are all facing, what we are doing to address that challenge, and I'll close with some candid comments about the complications of the efforts underway, but also their importance. First, our challenge. The New York Times published a story about Camden that focused on the development of the waterfront. Motivated by the presence of the aquarium, this article speaks of other corporations looking to move to the city, including the Philadelphia 76ers. The city's senior budget examiner is quoted in this article as saying, "In my mind, the city has already bottomed out and is on its way back up." Meanwhile, Samuel Benson, a longtime city resident, is quoted saying he didn't think the development would help the residents of Camden. "A political gimmick," he said. "I don't see it in my lifetime, Camden coming around. Maybe in my grandkids' lifetime, hopefully, but I think I'll be long gone if it happens." The New York Times published this story more than 21 years ago. Corporations are again interested in Camden, and the 76ers, the practice facility, is really now coming to the city. But Mr. Benson was prescient. He passed away in 2013, and we still have an unemployment rate more than double the national average, and more than half the children in Camden, 55%, live in poverty. I know most of you all are familiar with Camden. There have been many efforts to revitalize the city and reverse decades of systemic challenges, and those efforts have encountered a dizzying array of fits and starts. But today, when you speak to those who live in and around Camden, you get a sense of the resilience and the hope that has made this community strong for so many years. The purpose and the passion with which the community is addressing the myriad challenges the city faces. In some ways, it does feel as though a renaissance is upon us. At the same time, a skeptic could easily and reasonably claim déjà vu. And to be sure, the challenges are steep. You heard Andy run through them. Median household income is $26,000 compared to $71,000 statewide. In 2014, there were 32 murders, which is more than half what it was the year before. But that's still 9 times the national average and 32 more than there should be. And only 14% of our elementary and middle school students can read and do math on grade level. In March of 2013, after almost 20 years of discussion and trend and in-between stops, Governor Christie announced an official state intervention of Camden schools, a state takeover in effect. And this was after years of state appointments to the board. The intervention was a larger and more official effort to take over what the state had already great influence over. In August of that year, I was appointed as the superintendent. And on its face, it was simply the latest grand attempt to remake Camden without any evidence that it would improve the quality of life for Camden's residents. After all, other New Jersey cities have had their schools under state control for as long as 20 years without any consensus about improvements. To residents here, I was just the 12th superintendent in 20 years. I wasn't new, I was just the latest fad. So why should you or anyone else here be convinced that the work of improving Camden's public education will amount to anything beyond another newspaper headline? Well, you shouldn't, at least not yet. And that leads to how we're going to address this challenge. The first thing I did as superintendent was begin a 100-day listening tour throughout our city, 4 large town halls, dozens of informal conversations, and I've kept going on. We've now held over 55 public meetings, and that's on average 1 every 2 weeks, not including our board meetings, which I faithfully attend. I knew that the first order of business was to learn what I did not yet know. This community was, and still is, demanding significant changes. I hear it every single day. Safe schools and modern facilities with support for students and educators that leads to excellent teaching, empowered families, and a central office that is responsive to those needs. And with the scale of the challenge in front of us, we had to use every option we could. One of those options, though far from the only one, is Renaissance schools. The new facilities required by state law and a structure that puts education in the hands of educators and the option to attend a school in the hands of parents, Renaissance schools are consistent with what we heard from the community. Is that to say every last person agrees about Renaissance schools? Absolutely not. But there are 3 significant qualities that I do think are worth addressing with Renaissance schools that allow us to address those systemic challenges. The first is that public school operators that have a proven track record are serving our kids. There's no experimentation here. This is about empowering talented educators who have had great results to run great schools here. The second is the ability for new construction or renovation of existing buildings. Half of our buildings were constructed before 1928. Some of you are tired of me making that point. And so some of them are literally crumbling. We've spent decades waiting for the SDA to build schools that were promised but never came to fruition, and Renaissance schools provide more immediate solutions that families deserve. And third, and I would argue the most important factor, is that Renaissance schools are neighborhood schools. Camden families value neighborhood schools, in large part due to safety concerns, due to a lack of a strong public transportation infrastructure, and also because many lack a working car. And so this means that all the students in that neighborhood are guaranteed a seat at the Renaissance school. And that's really critical because that means not only do they have a choice, but regardless of their special needs profile, they have access to that school. Today, there are 7 Renaissance schools now open, and within 2 years, there will be 3 brand new modern facilities and 4 significantly renovated school facilities that have a long and important history in our city. The kind of high-quality facilities all of our kids deserve. I often get asked the question, why don't you just replicate what Renaissance schools or successful charters like LEAP are doing in our district schools? Herein lies an unfortunate truth. High-quality charters, which includes Renaissance schools, have more of the conditions necessary to see immediate results. Reforming from within the district bureaucracy is possible, but it takes far, far longer. And although there's less funding for Renaissance schools than traditional public schools, there's also less red tape and more flexibility and autonomy. And here's one anecdote to ground the conversation. 7 years ago, there was an agreement made to invest over $100 million in Camden High, the castle on the hill, a school facility that had been neglected for decades. With fingers being pointed left and right, that money was eventually pulled, and the community had nothing to show for it, and they could only claim a bait and switch. After significant lobbying by myself, the mayor, and many other community leaders, we finally resecured that commitment from the School Development Authority, which is great news. But by the time the dust settles on that construction, it will have been nearly a decade and literally thousands upon thousands of children who were denied the right of a modern 21st century learning environment that is provided to their wider, more affluent peers next door in Cherry Hill and Voorhees. Students who, like this past winter, suffered through hallways with a temperature of 55 degrees because the aging boiler was down yet again. Equity is harder to come by within the district, and it's unacceptable. And if it were easy to address, someone would have done it by now, but nobody has. And we're only talking about the material resources we owe our students in one school with this example. The quality of instruction is a separate, though related, and arguably far more important matter. We're faced with the same basic premise, however. Making progress is an uphill battle against deeply entrenched obstacles. Even so, we are moving with an extraordinary sense of urgency within our district schools, and we are seeing the fruits of those efforts. Our graduation rate is moving up. What was a bloated central office bureaucracy is now half the size it once was before my appointment. We're now providing regular professional development for our principals and teachers, and our pre-K enrollment last year was at a record high. These exciting and meaningful signs of progress are often lost in the noise and the debate, but they're what I wake up proud of when I think about our commitment to our families. But if you believe there's a moral imperative to do everything in our power to improve our schools as quickly as possible, like I do, then we must take a dual path approach and transform the status quo and make Renaissance schools and charter schools a choice for students and families. But let me also make clear that flipping the switch and converting all schools to charters and Renaissance schools isn't the answer either. Ultimately, results will do the talking, and families will make those decisions themselves. Today, across our 7 Renaissance schools serving 2,200 students, there's more demand than available seats. And when you evaluate the interim assessment results and the qualitative school visits, there are fledgling signs that students there are thriving academically. And finally, I'd like to comment on the consequences of these policy changes. That Black and Latino children in low-income communities are regularly denied the same quality education as their white peers in more affluent parts of the country is one of the most critical social problems of our time. But in our fight to address this inequity, we are creating a different set of social problems. Our central office today is wider than it was prior to my appointment. Our district schools that were transformed through our partnership with nonprofit Renaissance schools, which meant that all those teachers had to interview with the new school or retain their seniority rights and transfer to a different district school, happen to have some of the highest percentages of African American teachers and have been replaced by less diverse staff. In a city that has been long beleaguered by the effects of racism, we can't turn a blind eye to this reality. And these two developments are particularly problematic when you recognize that teaching was a critical vehicle of social mobility for African Americans in a post-Jim Crow America. And while I've been fortunate to have the support of many families and community leaders throughout the city, there are some other community members, some of whom are in attendance today or will be protesting outside the building, who oppose certain decisions and feel disenfranchised by the democratic structures that have been stripped away over the years. Those criticisms and frustrations are real, and they are the ones we must grapple with and address. There's always more we can be doing to mitigate these newfound social problems. But here's the thing, doing nothing is simply not an option. How can we expect our students to engage civically when the vast majority in Camden can't read critically? How can we bemoan the lack of employment opportunities when the vast majority of our students don't graduate with the skills to be employed, yet alone succeed in college? How can we resist the new temporary approach to district leadership when decades and decades of local control have led to few benefits for students, but plenty of adult-led scandals? And what can possibly be more disenfranchising than a student who doesn't graduate from high school? I want our current students to be the next generation of leaders in Camden, our future teachers, principals, superintendents, entrepreneurs, and medical professionals. And sooner than later, once we're on a path to stability, the local community should regain control of schools here. There's a great deal of work to do, but we're not talking 20 years from now, far sooner. In the meantime, we must press forward to do the hard work to restore the neglect and broken promises of the past several decades while building trust, while maintaining relationships, while keeping children and the future of this city at the root of every decision we make. Thank you for your time. I'm happy to take some questions.